says that they're looking to apply this framework within queer and trans communities. We'll definitely talk about that.
For sure.
And how can we put these practices into place right now? I hope you will be able to find like one tangible thing that you can start doing today.
Definitely.
All right, let's get started.
All right. So Karina, if you want to, get us started.
So hi everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. If you know me, you also probably know that we've been working on this series for a really long time. So I just want to take a moment to thank them so much for their time, for their energy, for their patience and commitment to showing up to this, showing up for us, even after all of the really wild obstacles, honestly, that have tried to stand in our way. So it's taken a bit for us to finally be here. But yeah, just wanted to express my deepest, most sincere gratitude that we have an opportunity to come together in this moment. We're also in the middle of a national uprising against anti-Black violence and systems of oppression. We've been taught, coerced, forced into valuing capital and property above people's lives, in a land that, in a country really that was built on forced labor from stolen people on stolen land, and these systems that bind and undergird our society are created and reinforced by and through legislation, but also especially in this moment, I'm thinking about our relationship to policing and to the police force, which for me at least makes this conversation so much more, so much more, immediate. I don't know. COVID has demonstrated to millions of people what a lot of us have already known, and have known for generations, right? Which is that the system, these systems, right, white supremacist, patriarchal capitalism has absolutely no vested interest in our lives or in our health beyond our capacity to work. Our economy doesn't care for or account for the needs of people beyond their ability to produce. And that's been demonstrated very obviously, by the way that the people have been left to fend for ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying that personally, I really believe in abolition. I believe in the fight. I believe in the destruction of systems that oppress us, that make it hard for us to live our lives in a way that isn't solely oriented around our ability to work or produce. And that abolition must come in multiple parts, right? And it comes in many forms. There is the deconstruction, the dismantling of systems and institutions that fail to serve us in many models. And then in a lot of contexts, there's a rebuilding, but transformative justice isn't really as much about the rebuilding, in the sense that we're trying to replace one structure with another. In this context, it has to do with finding new ways to be in relationship, it's about the falling and the failing and the hoping, right, into new modes of care, of accountability, of healing, of undoing. Our present moment is filled with so much rage, with violence, with disillusionment, with disappointment and frustration and delusion and fear and anticipation. And I'm really hoping that the things that we talk about today together can carry us into the next moment, right? There's so many things that we can be doing right now to practice freedom in this moment, to practice abolition in this moment. And we don't have to wait, we don't have to wait for some further off future in which the prison industrial complex and all of these other systems are formally abolished, right? There are things that people have been doing historically and things that people are doing now, again, in this moment, to operate and take care of ourselves without relying on the state. And so that's what I personally am really excited to get out of this talk, out of this conversation. It's something that I look forward to continuing learning about and unlearning with Stas and Lee in our digital workshop series that's going to be going through June and July. If you're a Vassar student, you can shoot us an email, PM, DM Black Students Union on Facebook or Instagram or something, and we can hook you up with the info on that. Okay, well, first met Stas and Lee, or was introduced to them a couple years ago by a friend who was in a different group that I was in, Ujima, who ended up working with them. And so, yeah, this whole thing has been about 2 years in the making. They do amazing work, and I'm really excited to let them tell you more about themselves and who they are and what they do.
Thank you so much, Karina. It's been lovely working with you for the last period of time. What is time anymore? I don't know. But I'm really happy we were able to make this happen. And I'm so happy that all of you were able to join. And we'll definitely share a little bit more about what we do. And we'll touch more on what is transformative justice. And in light of what's been happening, we're going to be focusing in a little bit more on what is abolition and why does it need to happen as well. And so I hope that you all are excited for the ride. I did want to make a couple notes on access. We have this being recorded, so the recording will be available later. It's being live streamed to YouTube as well as Instagram, and we're going to have a transcription available later after this is able to be transcribed after the recording, and so there will be other ways for engaging with this content after the fact. But if you have any other access needs or questions, feel free to direct message us or Karina, and we'll do whatever we can to make this a space that you feel is right for you.
Yeah, and I think, I won't go into it, but this has been rescheduled and reformatted and reimagined, I think at least 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. And that was after, a long process of figuring out what would actually serve the Vassar community. And now it's serving a broader community because we've reimagined it again into the current moment. And so I hope that this can be, even more powerful and just a space for us to come together and understand some of these frameworks that can help us create a more life-giving system.
For sure. Okay, so now we're gonna share our screen so that we can get started on the deck. If you have any issues seeing the screen or seeing us while we're speaking, please feel free to let us know. We're going to keep the chat open on the side so that we can get a sense of if there are any questions. But without further ado, this is Radical Care with Spring Up and the Vassar Black Student Union. So I'm Stas, I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the 2 co-founders and co-directors here at Spring Up.
My name is Lee. I go by they or he pronouns, and I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Spring Up.
And we're currently in Denver, Colorado, where we live, but we're really excited to be connecting with all of you around the country and maybe outside of the country as well. Karina already mentioned a little bit of this, but we just really wanted to name the context that we're in right now, which is both this moment of naming the violence against Black bodies, naming the violence of institutions associated with the prison industrial complex and the need to recognize the value of Black lives, and also being in the midst of a pandemic that has disproportionately been affecting Black folks because of what we know about health inequity, about access to healthcare, and about who are the essential workers that we're always talking about and who often aren't paid. They're called heroes, but not necessarily valued for the labor that they commit. And so we want to acknowledge kind of the world that we're living in right now as Black folks, as allies, as accomplices in this struggle. There's a lot that we're holding. And so while we're really excited to dive forward and thinking about what does abolition look like, how do we integrate care in any situation, I also want to be really aware of the fact that what care looks like now is very specific and that there's a very direct need. And that, I believe very deeply in an ecosystem approach to organizing, solidarity, collaboration, working with each other. And I think there's a moment right now to name anti-Blackness and white supremacy and to really all come together around the experiences that Black folks are having and to recognize that these systems are impacting all of us, all sorts of queer and trans folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, undocumented folks, like we're all being impacted in this. And I think that if we can all come together around the value of Black lives, I think that that can set us up for longer term coalition work and solutions that can work for all of us. But so because there's so much that we're holding, we always start our meetings and our sessions with a little bit of grounding. And so we just want to think about this space as, what can we grow from this crisis? What can we, there's so much pain, there's so much trauma, there's so much hardship, and there's also an opportunity for transformation, for advocacy, for new connections, for alliances, and for rethinking things that folks have taken for granted or have thought needed to exist. And so I'm really excited for this to be a space of radical imagining and of rethinking and of seeing this as an opportunity. So before we get started, we'd love to just start with a little bit of grounding. And this is a practice that we do all the time, every day, a pretty simple breathing practice that really connects with the grounding of your nervous system. So Lee, if you want to explain a little bit and then guide us in that breathing.
Yeah, and the purpose of this is to balance kind of your three minds in your body, your gut brain, your heart, and then of course your head brain. And so you're welcome to participate in this however you want to. I know for a lot of people it doesn't feel great to be in our bodies right now, and so if you don't want to do that, that's fine. You can do some part of it, none of it, do something that works for you. And one option would also be just finding a grounding object for you to have in your space. But if you'd like to do the breathing together, I invite you to place your feet on the floor and align your spine. Notice how you're sitting. How is your body feeling right now? And you can place your hands on your belly. You can close your eyes if you'd like to. And breathe into your belly. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Really let out a sigh, let out the energy. Breathe into your belly again. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Place your hands on your heart. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Breathe into your heart. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Finally, put your hands on your head. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. And now you can, do any stretching that your body is asking you to. You can stretch your shoulders, reach out your arms, clench and unclench your fists, and place your hands on one other part of your body that you think could use a little bit of energy, a little bit of love right now, and breathe in to that part of your body. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Awesome.
All right. Well, I have a tendency to really intellectualize or conceptualize these things and not kind of bring them back into my lived experience. And I found that through the educational system, we're really trained to digest information, but not necessarily have that integrate into the way that we relate to the world. And for me, doing a grounding practice, really connecting with my body so that I can be attuned to how information is landing on me. Is it landing in my tummy? Is it landing in my heart? That helps me have a better sense of what my actions need to be and how I need to integrate it without just having my wheels spinning, thinking all the time. So that's why I wanted to start that way. And thank you for guiding us in that. We wanted to start off a little bit, who are we? Why are we talking to you about this? Like what? And just articulate a bit of what our journey has been. We're gonna do this pretty quickly. There are other things out there that you can find that articulate more of our journey. But we just wanted to name first that we met in college. In case it probably isn't clear, we are a couple. We've been together for 8 years. And so we run this organization, and we also are real deep in community with each other. I can say that much. But so we met in college. when people ask us, or I'll say for myself, when people ask me, when did I start practicing transformative justice? It's like every time I get asked that question, I think of an earlier scenario. Like at this point, I have this scenario in 7th grade that's like so clear, community accountability. And I'm like gathering my friends and I'm like, the school can't handle this. Like, we're going to do it. They don't understand. And like, for me, it's really a lifestyle. It's an approach to the world. And there's not really a beginning, and hopefully there's not really an end either. But we met in college at Dartmouth, and we were both student organizers, particularly in the queer and trans community and with femmes of color.
Yeah, and we were doing that work on campus, just, you know, trying to build community, and noticing who was experiencing violence, noticing responses to that, and how inadequate they were. And then around that time, kind of between 2013 and 2015, was the campus student sexual violence movement, and also earlier iterations of Black Lives Matter. And so those issues really brought like the patterns of the violence that we were seeing and experiencing on campus into full light. And I think we then sort of really saw ourselves as being part of that conversation.
And I think an important part is that we spend years working with the administration and thinking about, you know, I'm realizing that we are not admitting people to this, my bad. Thinking about like how we could go through the right channels to make change, and just became very clear that that was a trap to keep us in a cycle of thinking that we were getting stuff done when the system was maintaining. And it was really important to us to have a coalitional approach to what we were doing, collaborating with Indigenous students, with students who were doing more anti-capitalism work, students from just different populations, and really thinking about how the issue of sexual violence and gender-based violence, so when we say gender-based violence, we mean sexual harm, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, relationship violence, and violence against the queer and trans community, that is something that can bring us all together, because who actually experiences that the most is based on who is at intersections of other forms of like marginalized identities. And so this felt like something that at the time really felt like it was considered a white woman's issue, and that like it was like not aligned with our communities to focus on those issues, or it became ostracizing. And it was really important to us to develop more of a coalitional and intersectional approach to doing sexual violence organizing.
And so I think that, you know, that took many forms. We led workshops, we wrote op-eds, we did a lot of direct action at the beginning there. And then the bottom photo is what we shifted more into later on, which is holding healing spaces for our community. And then in that top right photo, we really believe in prevention of whatever can be prevented about gender-based violence through transformative education for young people. And that to us is absolutely a pillar of transformative justice for us. Us, our friends, other people we've worked with, if we had had resources and the skills and tools to navigate intimacy, navigate gender, navigate communication as young people, I can see in my own life that that would have definitely prevented a lot of harm. And so that's a really valuable thing that we do. And that was kind of what our organizing in that phase led to, was we were like, okay, prevention, education, working with young people, and then trying to hold healing space for ourselves.
What was challenging was, as we got deeper and deeper into the feminist movement, it also became clear the ways that domestic violence organizing and sexual violence organizing, especially requests for mandatory minimums, contributed to the like creation and expansion of the prison industrial complex. And we were like, that's just not what we're about. And this led us to really think about re-pivoting our focus towards the abolitionist movement. Right after Trump was elected, I'm originally from Miami, South Florida, and it just became so clear the way that this election would impact people from my hometown and my community. And we felt that we needed to kind of pivot our focus towards working in the abolitionist movement and holding accountability processes around gender-based harm amongst organizers. And so we did about 3 years of very intense, like pretty specific transformative justice accountability cases, and holding preventative kind of workshops in education, and training folks to do the type of transformative justice response that we did, culminating in a 6-month fellowship in South Florida for youth organizers to learn how to prevent and respond to gender-based violence using consent education and transformative justice.
Yeah, and I think these 3 photos represent like 3 of the approaches that we took. The bottom left is a group of community organizers from a variety of different organizations, especially Dream Defenders, coming together to skill up and do a 3-day training on transformative justice and on building, just brainstorming, learning frameworks, and thinking about how we can create better systems, better infrastructure in our community organizations to respond to harm. The top one is a performance about the future of gender that we did during Art Basel. And then on the right side, that's a restorative justice circle for the queer and trans community. So I think especially the trans community, that was in talking about gender-based violence
and safety planning
without relying on the police. And
Yeah.
so I'm planting kind of these little seeds because my inclination is that many of you are doing things already to try to prevent, respond to harm in your communities. And I think it wasn't until maybe 2017, 2018 that we really like had the language of transformative justice for what we were doing. And so I think that that's something I always like to share, because I think people are like, this is a very abstract concept, or this seems complicated, or how do I get trained in this? And I think that it's very important to like the ethos of transformative justice to understand what is being practiced in your community, what are the skills and resources that you have, and then intentionally kind of leveraging that to alleviate harm.
And I want to say, like, I had read texts that talked about transformative justice, but it felt outside of me. Like, it felt like something that these incredible older organizers were doing, that they really like knew how to do, and that somehow that was not what I was doing. And it was through the process of really meeting those people, engaging in those communities, and really being validated that the type of work that we were doing fit into transformative justice. And we had been learning from those tools, but kind of using our own strategies that aligned with our communities. And I think that that's true of a lot of people, that the work that they're already doing fits into transformative justice. They don't necessarily feel confident or feel that they have the community to be able to articulate that that's what they're doing. So we wanted to share a little bit of that story, and just remind you that definitely feel free to use the chat if you have any questions or comments about what we're talking about as we're sharing. But that's just to orient you. One of the biggest lessons that we learned doing transformative justice work in schools and in partnership with student organizers was really this difference between what's harmful and what's illegal. So what schools and what the government really focus on is what's illegal, right? And the truth is that most sexual, gender, and race-based violence does not meet legal definitions or standards, or doesn't end up being followed through on when it's reported to the police or to the administrations of schools. It's still harmful, even if it's not illegal, right? And this would include like emotional abuse. This would include just like so many, I mean, just so few cases having to do with these things end up being managed by the police or by our administrations. And so if it doesn't meet legal standards, harm is often not taken as seriously or not considered as impactful, which is totally untrue. And I know that just the number of young people that I've worked with over the years whose families, whose friends have been like, oh, that like kind of random thing, just because it didn't end up going through a formal process. And then that leads to so much isolation and just not really acknowledging the impact that this experience has on someone and the potential for transformation and healing if we make the space to address it within our communities and that brings us to the next point, which is that the response to harm has been compartmentalized and professionalized outside of our communities. And so that means that, and I had a friend of mine who's a doula who talks about the idea that communities always had the ability to birth children, right? Like that was expected, like people knew how to figure that out. And then it was as that became medicalized, as that became professionalized, that communities lost that knowledge. And so the same thing around harm and violence. Our communities knew how to respond to violence and how to respond to harm without depending on this sort of like punitive police system. And it was as it became compartmentalized and professionalized as part of the state that we lost that ability and developed this sense of dependence. And so the other kind of flip side of this is that if a situation does meet legal standards, the response is really not designed to be about accountability and healing. It's not to center the survivor's needs, and it's not really about growth and transformation for the person who committed the harm. And one of the ways that you can see this is that when there's like a crime that's being responded to by the state, it's the state versus the person who's being held responsible, not the survivor. Versus the person who's being held responsible, which means that the thing that's being violated is the law, not the survivor's consent or experience, right?
And we see this when if you did experience sexual assault or rape and went to the police and made a claim of that, they don't need any further participation from you in order to press charges, go through a process. They're not going to ask you, what do you want? What does justice look like for you? They're going to try to find like, okay, can we prove that this person broke some law? That's notoriously difficult to find in, intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence cases. And if they don't find that evidence, then it's dismissed. Or if they do find that evidence, then they move ahead with having a one-size-fits-all punitive approach towards that person who caused the harm that doesn't take into account that person's learning and growth and doesn't do anything to shift the likelihood of that happening again.
So I want to uplift what Karina was saying at the beginning, and which we'll continue to say throughout this. Transformative justice is not like a replacement for the system that's currently like working, because it's not working, right? There's so much of the violence that we think needs to be addressed that is not addressed by the system. And then so many things that this system addresses that do not need to be responded in a criminal way. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I want to share first that there's just a content warning. The next two slides that we're going through are naming some of the history of state violence. And that's particularly just to name like, what was this system designed for? Because we hear all the time, like, it can be made better. It can do what we claim that it's supposed to do. But the reality is that it's doing exactly what it was designed for. And so we want to talk a little bit about what the original design was and how it's rolled out over time.
Yeah, and just to frame that in the sense of what's harmful versus illegal, what we're going to talk about is a lot of stuff that was extremely, extremely, extremely harmful. More harmful than like most people could potentially imagine if they've like been insulated from that by privilege. Just extremely harmful legacies. And all of that was legal.
I mean, not only legal, it was performed by the state, or it was encouraged by the state. And so when we think like, if the state is actually seen as one of the major or biggest actors of harm in our communities throughout history, how could we see that same infrastructure as being the response to violence and harm? So we're not gonna, dig into this too much. We just want to share a little bit. The first is, what was the criminal legal system designed for? This is by a professor. Capitalism is a history of wages as well as whips, of factories as well as plantations, of whiteness as well as blackness, of freedom as well as slavery. And this is around racialized capitalism and the idea that capitalism doesn't exist outside of the structures of slavery and exploitation. So the police were created primarily to protect capital, not to protect people. These were adapted from chain gangs that were used to transport, control, and track down escaped slaves or enslaved people. The goal was to enforce the law and maintain control, not about supporting accountability, healing, and transformation. And that's a lot of what Karina was talking about at the beginning, right? That like, this is about capital, this is about the maintenance of wealth and ownership. And when people are considered property, it's also about the maintenance of the ownership of those people.
And we see that right now when people say that a protest has become violent because, a trash can was lit on fire or a window was broken. That is not violence per se, that is a reaction, and they use that to then commit actual violence to be, I won't even list what they're doing to people right now.
Right, like who's making protests violent? Protests violent? Is it perhaps the armed armies of people who have like weapons and are antagonizing the population, and as they have done since they were created. Like, that's probably the violence that we need to be talking about when we're thinking about what's happening in the streets. Another key thing to keep in mind is that police, even when you speak to police officers, many of them will name that they're expected to respond to issues that they have very little to no training in, and often they end up doing harm in their attempts to respond. And so there's, we'll talk about it in the next bullet point. Obviously, there's the intentional harm of the infiltration of racialized terror groups, but there's also folks who join the police who feel that they just don't have the training necessary to respond to the types of situations that they're expected to respond to. An example of this is that in queer intimate partner violence cases, when the police are called, the survivor is just as likely to be arrested as the person who's committing the harm.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to say that in response to that, like, because of how capital is being deployed, because of how especially like communities of color have been disenfranchised, like there is active recruitment of people from Black and brown communities, from low income communities, into the police and into the military. And I think that our framework of transforming justice and decarceration has frameworks for those people to exit those structures and provide resources, provide support to their communities if that's possible, in a different framework.
Right. And so then we just want to name that the police have historically included members of racial terror groups. They've delivered people of color and Black folks to white mobs, and they've participated in lynchings. And that includes the lynchings that we see today. The police killings that we're seeing, I would put in the same category as lynchings. And just some things to keep in mind around that: 1/3 of Americans who are killed by a stranger are killed by a police officer. Black teens are 21 times as likely to be killed by police than white teens, and half of people killed by police have disabilities. And that's something that I don't hear people naming as much, especially because when we talk about the abolition of police, we often revert to the medicalization or seeing like crazy people or disabled people as the people who need to be managed, and kind of turning social workers into police. And so I think it's also important for us to center disability justice and think about the way that disabled folks are being targeted and impacted by the police and state systems. So that was a lot of information. There's going to be one more slide about this that's more about prison. I personally am just going to take a breath before we move forward and just remind you that if you know this and you're like, I don't need this, you can tune out until the slide after this, put us on mute, and then you can see the slide. It's going to be real clear after we finish the next text, but I think it's important to name where we came from. So just big breath.
And I think some of this framing too, I know some of you are here to learn about, why abolition, like over reform. And so that's some of why we're sharing this before we get into transformative justice specifically. But I know others of you are very familiar with this. Totally. And I always find it helpful when people pull together like these little bullet points and just arguments that you can pass on to the other people in your life who aren't quite at this level of, seeing things yet.
For sure. Okay, so then why is the legal system biased against Black people? Sophania Davis is an incredible restorative justice practitioner, one of the founders of restorative justice for Oakland youth. And in her book, Race and Restorative Justice, she articulates from virtually its inception, the US justice system has been used to brutally subjugate Black people and expropriate their labor power. So in the 1790s, the contemporary understanding of the penitentiary that we see today was conceived in the United States. It was actually a reform against cardinal, what do you call it? What is it?
Corporal.
Corporal.
Like beating people.
Corporal punishment. And so it was seen as a way for you to meditate in solitary confinement with the creation of this panopticon surveillance structure. But when it was first created, it was 99% white prisoners because Black folks were already being imprisoned on plantations. But once emancipation happened, which is what we're going to talk about next, that flipped, and the vast majority of people in penitentiaries ended up being Black folks and people of color. So in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, which made slavery illegal, except to punish people who had been convicted of crimes. And so immediately you see the creation of Black codes and convict leasing. What that means is Black codes are things like Black folks can't walk near railroads, can't spit, eat or do gestures in front of white men, which of course they can just claim that you did. And then once they're picked up by chain gangs, right, or once they're picked up by folks, they then are brought into this system of convict leasing, in which plantation owners can lease or can borrow folks who are incarcerated to do labor. And one of the key things to keep in mind is that you see the direct tie, right? When cotton season comes, there's a huge surge in arrests. And 1/3 of labor camps were adolescent boys, which is very similar to what we see kind of happening today. And because when folks owned the enslaved people, they had an incentive to keeping them alive, you saw actually a higher death rate when there was convict leasing, because they could just replace them with other convicts that they could lease. So that means that there were death tolls at camps of up to 50%, and that folks who were part of, were enslaved, after emancipation, there are folks who never got to see freedom because they were immediately picked up, and some of them were brought back to the same exact plantation that they were on before emancipation.
And we see this, I think, the prison labor and really prison slavery, because that labor is not compensated, or compensated like just vastly below a minimum wage. We see that right now, and especially how those people are being deployed to making hand sanitizer, making face masks, doing things for the state to kind of help bulk up what the market is not doing, as well as being put in very dangerous jobs like forest fighting or firefighting. Don't fight the forest. Yeah,
Please do.
Yeah, firefighting and other, or just doing, things like making stuff for Victoria's Secret, like,
yeah, or license plates. And so after the black codes and convict leasing were outlawed, it shifted to debt slavery, sharecropping, and peonage, which was basically just another name for the same thing. And then you have Jim Crow and mass incarceration. And something to keep in mind is that the US is 5% of the world population, but 25% of the prison population. We have more people incarcerated than any group ever, which means that when you ask, like, if not this system, what? Literally anything that any nation has ever done outside of what this nation is doing right now involves less incarceration. So like we have an infinite number of other ways of responding to the situation out there.
Yeah, and just to like name it again, the reason why we can't just reform the existing system is because this pattern shows that all of this is just a justification to keep getting free, low-cost labor, keep people of color under a system of correctional control, and to have reasons to say, this is illegal, that's illegal, being out after 8 p.m. is illegal, consuming certain substances is illegal, to be able to have that level of control.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
just checking the chat.
Great. Okay, so then Black people are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. The number of stats that I could find about who's actually being incarcerated and affected by police violence is like shocking. I just wanted to include some of the main ones. And something to keep in mind is also that the infrastructure of the prison system is also built on extracting money from the poor, right? So this includes the number of fees when you get arrested and when you're put into prison, bail, which is before you're charged with anything, you have to pay money to be able to get out, commissary. And then there are people who, when they are let out, they need to pay to rent their own ankle monitoring bracelets, and if they can't pay, they get put back in prison. So like all of these are ways to criminalize poverty and keep people in the system with like just excuses, because a huge percentage of the people who are incarcerated are, guilty of nonviolent crimes, are like have never even been charged with anything. And even if you are talking about people who are guilty of violent crimes, I really want us to deconstruct that idea and the kind of conception of law and order and criminal minds that we have, and really rethink like who are people, what causes crime and violence, and the vast majority of the time it's not having what you need, and not having other ways for addressing conflict and harm. And so this is just a little bit of like, what what got us here? What is this system about? And finally, and this is for any of you who were pausing while we were going through that content, this is kind of the close of it, which is the system is working at what it was designed to do. These are not mistakes. This is not like, oh no, I can't believe that we did this. This is what it was supposed to do. This was the purpose. And if we want a different outcome, we have to redesign the system with the intention of healing, accountability, and transformation, not with the intention of extracting labor, isolating communities, and taking advantage of and subjugating Black and Brown folks and anyone who dissents from the norm and the kind of power structures that are in place. So why abolition? Because this stuff was not built for us. Okay, so when we talk about what abolition means, what is abolition? I really appreciate this report made by MPD 150. Do you want to name a little bit of who they are?
Yeah, sure. So that was a group that in 2017 looked at the 150-year history of the Minneapolis Police Department and just identified like what's really been happening. I think it's also important to note that the Minneapolis Police Department is very reformed. They were already doing 7 of the 8 like reforms that are currently being proposed. And so I think that Minneapolis is seen as, in many ways a progressive city, a fairly well-resourced city. And so they're still finding these just deep structural problems within that very police department that murdered George Floyd.
So when they talk about what abolition means, they say we're talking about a gradual process of strategically reallocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from police and toward community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. So it's not like there's actually a process of so much of what we're doing in community, so much of what we're doing in transformative justice, so much of the ways that we're trying to support each other feel like we're overextended, feel like we don't have the support, the capacity, the funding that we need to do this work well. And the challenge is that you look at how much money the prison and the police system have, and they're still messing up. So like, what would our communities look like if that money was actually invested in our well-being, was actually invested in housing, in education, in jobs, and also in creating tools that respond to harm and violence, but that are rooted in the community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. Like you can say, oh, what are models that have already worked? And we can share models that have done really, really well. But in general, when you're putting any of these models of TJ up against the prison system, and you actually think about how many people do they have? How much time do they have? How much money do they have? It's completely ridiculous to think that we would be able to get perfect outcomes when this system with this amount of funding and backing is still producing mistakes constantly. So what would it look like for us to have that kind of funding? I promise you that we could do a much better job than we're currently doing and then the police and the prisons are doing.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a reimagining happening where people are like, wait, how do these, police unions, police departments have so much control over cities? How are they siphoning off over half of the city's budget in major cities? And I think I'm really excited to see people just realizing like, wait, why are we using our resources in this way, especially to have this, group of armed people who are not trained to respond to the types of actual problems that communities have, just kind of throwing, a militarized response at it is not a way to sort of fix the social safety net or get people what they need.
An example of this is in New Orleans, 63% of the state's budget goes towards the police. Like, what? Meanwhile, 4% or 3% goes towards children, families, and job creation. So like, where are our values? What are we prioritizing, right? Okay, so what do we mean by abolition? There are 3 frameworks that we really, really appreciate. First, to name that the reason why it's called abolitionist is because it's a continuation of the abolitionist movement to end slavery. As we named before, this is the same system that was in place during slavery. So first, there's critical resistance. Incredible work out there if you look into them, if you want to learn more about abolition. So many tangible tools, frameworks, practices. And what they articulate is that there are 3 pillars to practicing abolition. One is moratorium, no more jails. So they're constantly trying to open jails. I know there was this example of they opened a trans-only prison, I think in California, and it was like to combat this idea of like trans people being isolated in prisons. And so we'll just make a trans-only prison. Surprise, surprise. They populated it. They arrested higher percentages of trans people after they created this prison. So that type of reform only leads to like more arrests from within our community. And so we need to have less jails, not more.
Yeah. Excuse me 1 minute. I'm gonna go check on our dog. You totally.
Yeah, our dog is really freaking out. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so moratorium is no new jails. Decarceration is get them out, right? You saw all of these ideas of free them all when COVID was happening. We know that COVID was spreading more within prisons. We know that people who were unable to pay bail were kept in prison. And there was a win in Miami about getting folks who couldn't make bail released during COVID. These are the types of wins that fit into an abolitionist thing. Even if it's just responding to this situation, anyone that we can get out of the system is a win. And then finally, excarceration, which is preventing people from going into the system in the first place. So this is where restorative justice and transformative justice fits in, because if we can manage issues within our communities without getting the police and prisons involved, then that's actually preventing them from being necessary in our communities. And this can be as formal as what Impact Justice does, which is a partnership with the state attorney's office to divert felony youth cases before they're charged. So that means having a community organization that's able to manage the harm within the community. And then if they're able to solve it, then the charges get dropped. I was one of the co-facilitators of the first youth juvenile felony diversion case in Miami-Dade County, and we were able to, the young woman was facing 25 to life, and we were able to solve and kind of address the situation within community and get the charges dropped. Or this can be more informal, which is just managing issues in the community, having infrastructure for safety and support in the community in a way that just makes you less likely to need to call 911 or have other people or infrastructure that you can call instead of 911. And you can look that up, alternatives to 911. There's so many resources and organizations that are developing support systems for that. So that's kind of 3 strategies for doing abolition work. The next one is Ruthie Gilmore talks about how abolition is both an absence and a presence. So we've talked about this absence, which is taking away the current police and prison system that's in place, but that has to go with a presence, which is us showing up for each other, us showing up for people who are hurt, and us showing up for people who have done harm. And we'll talk a little bit about disposability politics after this, but kind of the patterns in our communities are to isolate and say, hey, get a therapist and you can solve that. Or I don't want to be associated with that person because they've been called out for doing something bad, and to kind of compartmentalize and isolate people who are in systems of violence and harm. Now, the problem is that that is what justifies needing to have an external actor like the state intervene. And so we need to start showing up for each other and really thinking like, what do I have the capacity to do? And what am I willing to face within people that I love within my community as their whole selves, and that's what's necessary in order to replace what's currently happening. And that can be really challenging, and you don't have to do everything, but there's a truth to the fact that we were all socialized into systems of harm. We have all committed harm. And to claim that it's the people who are being identified as having done harm or being investigated by the police as the bad ones or the people who are creating the violence and harm in our communities is absurd, because we know that the violence and harm is already there structurally and systematically, as we expressed before, and that all of us are socialized to participate in it. And so kind of shunning and facing away from people who are being named as part of this issue is part of what contributes to having the state intervene on those problems.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we treat people who are problematic like we need to get rid of them and then have a lot of grace for the system that it can like always learn and grow. The system doesn't really learn and grow. The system just adapts. People can learn and grow. And so I think that that's kind of like, I'd love to see that just like flipped, because like we can reimagine and rebuild systems, and people are the ones who like can actually like transform and grow.
100%. And then Mariam Kaba talks about how abolition needs to be both an external process and an internal process. And that's because this idea of prisons and police is built on the idea of isolation and punishment. And even if the police and prisons aren't there, we in our communities have internalized that same thing. We still isolate and punish people who are identified as having done harm. And we even isolate and punish people who are identified as having experienced harm because we don't feel like we have the ability to handle it. And so this abolitionist journey, and someone asked at the beginning, what's something that I can do immediately? The only way that this process is going to work is if we all commit to that internal process of unlearning punishment and adapting to understand how to integrate healing and accountability as a lifelong practice and a skill set that each and every one of us needs to hold and that needs to be normal within our communities. And that's something, having conversations with people in your life, really doing some reading and processing yourself about how has punishment shown up in your life? What did timeout look like? What, all of those things. What did punishment look like in your life? And what are ways that we can unlearn and rethink that in alignment with healing and accountability? So that's kind of, what do we mean by abolition?
And there are, huge implications for that, especially in how we socialize our children, which is people going into education, people who are parents, definitely have like a huge role to play in that. And before you can really like change how you relate to other people, though, it's really important to do that work yourself, because so much of the time we're like, if we grew up being like punished, being blamed, being shamed, then you have those scripts running in yourself. And so that takes a lot of personal work to like unlearn that shame, unlearn that blame, and just like treat yourself with compassion and respect, and like allow yourself the freedom to just experience things, learn, grow, be human. And then I think it's very beautiful when people can then extend that to children in their lives.
For sure. I feel like we are some of the most punishing people of ourselves. And so if we can learn to move through that internally, then it becomes a much easier practice with others. So we wanted to talk a little bit about disposability politics. So like we said, our communities have internalized this punishment mindset and mentality. And so when we talk about punishment, that can sometimes, the desire not to punish can sometimes cause people to collude or make excuses or ignore or erase the fact that violence and harm is happening. So that brings up the question of like, what's the sweet spot? And that's where we think about boundaries are totally fair, right? Like if someone has harmed you and you're like, I can't be in space with them, that's a really fair boundary. Like disposability politics doesn't mean like, oh, you have to like continue to be in space and love and heal and forgive the person who harmed you. Like we're not, like saying that we don't want to dispose of people does not mean like shaming survivors for their needs around their boundaries, right? So like boundaries are fair. And yet saying that a survivor needs to have boundaries is not the same thing as the community canceling that person and being like, we don't want you to exist anymore. And we're going to like dox you and shame you in public and say that you're the worst person ever and no one should ever be friends with you, right? Like that's not the same thing. And then consequences, which is like, if you violated the trust of a community, it might make sense that it takes work, it takes processing, it takes rebuilding those relationships in order for that to feel like a comfortable, friendly space for you, right? That's a consequence of your action. That's not a punishment. And so there's some really good language around this in Fumbling Towards Repair by Mariam Kaba and Shira Hassan. There's a whole map of like the difference between punishment and consequences. And I just really want to acknowledge that when we're saying like don't dispose of people, that also doesn't mean don't have boundaries or don't have consequences for people's actions, right? We don't want to just like excuse violence, but we also don't want to like totally push people out. And that's something that we'll be exploring a lot more in this ongoing learning space with Vassar students over the summer. Again, if you're interested in that, there's a link at the end of this to sign up for that teach-in series.
Yeah, and then shame, I think that there's so much that can be said about this. We have a video about this specifically that I think was maybe shared as pre-work for this.
I don't think
Maybe
so.
not.
It's in the summer program, but you can look it up. It's the Barnard Center for Research on Women, Shame and Accountability. And we have like a 5-minute video that is about how shame blocks people from being able to access accountability and just like what shame is.
Yeah. And then scapegoating, this happens a lot in many different communities. When, let's say there's a kind of widespread, issue of heteropatriarchy in a community, and then one person gets called out for doing something that's seen as like particularly sexist. the rest of the community, even though they know they've been complicit in all of the other behavior, might rush to be like, oh yeah, that's so terrible, like we totally blame that person, and kind of have over accountability, or like a sense of targeting and blame towards that person, um, sort of to absolve themselves from any complicity. You know, most systems of harm that are normalized in communities, almost like every member of the community does uphold, even just passively. And so taking accountability can also just mean like owning that. We do a really powerful exercise with people that's like, what's a system of harm that you've unlearned? And that can just cause like really really great realizations about, you know, how we uphold these systems and what it takes to learn and grow. And then also survivors can be, oh thanks Karina for sharing that link. Survivors can definitely be scapegoated as well. I think it depends on the norms of the community, but I think that's almost more common realistically, is that someone who raises a problem, who's kind of like a whistleblower for the community, everyone's like, we really don't want to deal with that. And that gets kind of like shut down, and it's very easy for that person to kind of get pushed out of the system rather than for the whole like community to make a change.
And it's a mechanism for communal cleansing, right? It's like, we know that this problem exists, but we're going to pretend that it doesn't exist. And then all of a sudden someone's saying that this problem exists, and so we're going to make that person the problem. All of a sudden that individual is the embodiment of all of the problems of our community, and if we just get rid of them, or we make them seem really bad and like we don't agree with them, that like purifies us of our complicity within this system, right?
Yeah, I don't think any one person really has the power to like make a community toxic,
right?
Or to like,
well, maybe if they're like fully in charge, but it's
no, but
mostly that they're unearthing
kind of,
something, right? Like
yeah.
even with Trump, he can be super toxic, but he's highlighting something that already exists within our communities, and that's what we really need to be talking about. And I think related to that is like, I don't want us to fall into the same pattern of projection with police and prisons. Like, police and prisons are super messed up. The history is horrible, as we already expressed, but the reality is that our communities also have internalized punishment. Our communities also have racial bias. There's anti-Blackness in Black communities, in brown communities, in queer communities. We all have it. And so this whole like, oh, you know, Black Lives Matter, whatever, on your little black box on Instagram, like that could be a way of naming that the police and prisons are the problem, without, as like a way of cleansing yourself of your own anti-Blackness, or cleansing your community of your complicity within these systems of violence. And so as much as I think we need to abolish prisons and police, and we need to take action to like hold them accountable, we also can't fall into this pattern of projecting that they are the problem, when in fact they're indicative of a larger trend within our communities.
Yeah, and I feel like especially along your sites of privilege, and especially in this moment for people who are not Black, it's just a really great question to be like, how am I the problem? Like, how am I contributing to the problem? How am I enabling the problem? How have I internalized the problem? And that's like just a really great like line of inquiry, without taking it all on yourself, because you as a person also did not create the problem, but
right.
you may be enabling it.
Right. But that's work that you can do, right? Is that personal work. Okay, so then that brings us to, what is transformative justice? Transformative justice is a strategy for responding to harm and violence that is rooted in our own communities, in our own practice, right? So particularly, and if you join the class, or if you join our Patreon community, we talk a lot more about what are the differences between RJ and TJ. But I think the key piece here is that transformative justice really tries to address the root causes of violence. What are the conditions that allowed for this violence to exist in the first place? And the reality that if one person is experiencing this violence, or this dynamic is present within one relationship, it's likely present within a lot of other dynamics within the same community. And so whatever we do to address this situation should also be implemented in a way that shifts the conditions of the community itself. And that's why community education, prevention work, healing work are all under the umbrella of transformative justice, in addition to the accountability processes that it's most known for. And the goal here is that it's to return the skill of responding to harm and violence to the community. Again, it's not an alternative to the police, because the infrastructure of the police is not designed for the same purpose, right? And we don't want TJ to all of a sudden be managing all of the things that police do, right? Like, I don't want to have a TJ process because someone had a parking violation. Like, that's not the point. And then finally, it's about shifting mindsets and police outside, always interrupting. It's about a shift in mindsets and personal practices. And so transformative justice can be just as much something that you're doing yourself, something that you're doing in your relationship, as much as it is holding a formal accountability process for someone who has experienced harm or has committed harm.
And if y'all have any like questions or thoughts kind of coming up, you're definitely welcome to post those in the chat. Definitely curious how this is landing on you, what this is bringing up, what you're wondering about. We might not address everyone like kind of as it's posted, but just good to keep in mind, like, what are you thinking? And then maybe we can get to some of that at a Q&A at the end.
Yeah, so then when we're talking about transformative justice, the goal is to facilitate healing and accountability. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by healing at the end, but with accountability, a key thing is that we hear people all the time saying you need to hold someone accountable. That's not possible, right? So like something to keep in mind is that the punishment system, the punitive system, is a passive thing. It's something that's done to you. You don't actually have to participate in it. It just happens to your body, right? Whereas accountability is something that you actively have to do, and therefore it has to be consensual. It has to be something that you're choosing to embark on. It's not something that I can make you do, right? And that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about transformative justice, is that it has to be a consensual process, or else you get performative accountability and performative apologies, and that's not what we're looking for. That does bring up the question of what if someone doesn't want to be accountable, and that is like a whole conversation, but I think that it's really important for us to ask ourselves, what are the things that would prevent someone from being accountable, including the fact that if someone acknowledges I did this and I want to grow from it, is their entire community going to then turn on them and tell them that they're a terrible person? Because that's probably not a very good incentive for taking accountability, right? So like, what do we and our communities set up to make it very difficult for someone to choose to be accountable consensually? So these definitions I really appreciate. There's no way to hold people accountable. People can only take accountability. Accountability is a continuous, active, and voluntary process of being responsible to yourself and to those around you for your choices and the consequences of your choices. Unlike punishment, it's something that we do rather than something that is done to us. And therefore, it's also an ongoing life process. It's not something that can be fully facilitated within an accountability process. And that brings up the question of, how do you end it, you know? And it's really that the process is about giving people the tools, the relationships, and the practices that they need to embark on that lifelong healing and accountability journey. It doesn't encapsulate the whole thing in and of itself. And then Connie Burke of the Northwest Network, in the seminal essay, Think, Rethink, that's in the Revolution Starts at Home, which is one of the first books that really went out there talking about transformative justice, says accountability is an internal resource for recognizing and redressing the harms we have caused to ourselves and others. And this is something that is so powerful to help kids understand from the time that they are very young. Like, this is a lifelong practice. This is like that moment that's like, I said I was going to do the dishes and I didn't, and not being like, well, you know, this other thing happened, and making excuses and blah, 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 but learning how to actually apologize and be like, you know what? Yeah, I said I was going to do that. I didn't do it. It was messed up, and I'm sorry. And this is what I'm going to do to repair the harm, right? Like, that's what we're talking about when we're saying learning this practice on a small scale so that then it can be scaled up. If you don't know how to handle not doing the dishes, how do you think you're going to know how to handle intimate partner violence, right?
Right. And that's where it's difficult when people grow up, become whole adult people who have internalized these systems, and then are confronted with one thing that they might be complicit in, and just become completely fragile, totally defensive, really like, you know, reactionary and angry. And I think that that's also a challenge, to be like, how do we relate to, and especially I think a lot of people on this call are like, you know, younger or like students. How do we hold space for older people in our lives to like have some of these realizations when they were socialized in this way? And I think there's a, you know, different level of urgency for that with like older white people who are literally like upholding these systems and being extremely fragile when they're confronted with the reality of what they're enabling. And I think that's a difficult question, but we do try to hold space, I think, for, we do adult community education, and especially within organizations, within like nonprofits and stuff, we hold space for adults to learn and grow and like have some of these frameworks. And it is really powerful when you can see that they're receptive to that and then do apply that in their work. And so I think even that is possible, although, you know, sometimes resistance or pretending like you don't understand is definitely a form of like
pushback
right. And rejecting like, something.
I'm confused. I don't get it, which is actually like, I hate it. I totally disagree, but I don't want you to hear me say that because I'm not supposed to say that.
Because I want to like maintain my passive power. And so I think we're kind of dealing with a complicated thing here because white supremacy, patriarchy, many of these systems, like they thrive by saying that they're trying to help people, saying that they're good and well-intentioned, saying that the people implementing them are ignorant of what they're doing. And so when you do try to hold systems accountable, that is what comes up. And so that's just something to watch out for. And I think some people are like genuinely like opposed to that. And I like when they push themselves to actually say that. I think that's a powerful moment for someone to be like, admitting one of their deep internal biases, because even then you can like kind of work through that, or they might hear how it sounds and they're like, ooh.
But it's a moment of trust and vulnerability to admit your biases. And that's one of the biggest breakthroughs that I love in processes is when someone just ultimately is like, I just think that men are supposed to be in charge and I don't know what else you want me to say. I'm like, yes, you do think that. I'm so happy you're acknowledging it. Let's work through it. Let's like talk about it from there, because now we can actually face the problem that we're here to talk about, right?
Yeah.
And someone in the chat asked, like, how does transformative justice hold space for when people are like, kill all rapists, right? And I really appreciate that question, because I think that rage is really important. It's really important for people to be able to express their anger, right? And yet we don't want to actually kill all of these people, at least in terms of our values of response.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I think I wouldn't want to like label anyone's like politics or thought process, but often early in a process, survivors, especially if they feel like justice and healing and transformation doesn't feel accessible to them or hasn't been enabled for them, it's so common for survivors to come into a process with a ton of anger, demands that might not even be feasible, or that if they kind of like work through why this is activating to them and what they really want, those demands might turn into things that are more attainable, are less punitive. And I think in a transformative justice process, we do also work with survivors to kind of also move away from a sense of being punitive. But I think that sentiment of like, just, you know, get rid of people who are causing harm comes from like a long, deep well of pain of knowing that people have been complicit, people have enabled, and that like it needs to stop.
And one of the ways that we'll process that is creative writing. So we're fiction writers, and I think that that's one of the most powerful tools in a transformative justice process is, okay, that's what you want. Let's write about it. Like, okay, write, like, because our minds process our imagination as though it's really happening, right? So being able to like just have that cathartic experience of having out whatever it is that you are like wanting to imagine, and then we can process like, did that meet what you were looking for? Like, what are other ways that you can address the rage that you're feeling? And that can be really transformative.
And it's okay to have like fantasies of revenge, fantasies of, you know, whatever. But hopefully you have like supportive people who you can kind of talk through those through before you probably act on them.
And then another question is, how does this relate to murder? If someone is killed, then often the loved ones that they leave behind operate as the survivors in the process, so you can still facilitate something.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing is I'm getting intra-communal. Would that mean within the community? I think that's a challenging thing as to like how we define community, because as a like queer trans person, the community that I was socialized in was very enabling of harm and did not want to be accountable, and I did not trust them to hold space or care or like hold accountability for the things that I had experienced within that community. And so I think that's where like chosen community, micro communities, and then this idea of like your pod, which we'll get into later, of like, who are your 5 people, who are, you know, your go-to things, and really making community like tangible, concrete, not abstract, because, you know, you could have a successful process that really only like 2 or 3 people participate in.
And then there are a few more questions here. I'd love to just respond as quickly as possible because I think they're really good questions. So how can you like work through a process within institutions where people are constantly coming in and out. That is so real, especially because many processes take a really long time and people might be off campus. We have a lot of thoughts about like kind of innovative models on college campuses. And so I think that that's like, it's hard for me to articulate in a small thing. The truth is we're actually really pro remote processes as well, and realizing that they can take a longer time and that you can continue them. I also am not that into the administration taking on a like role of implementing these things because they're going to pervert it. So it has to be something that's done outside of the administration and outside of student services as something that the students are doing for each other. And I think that you can continue to be in relationship with each other. We also, even if folks leave campus, we also have a like series of steps around a series of steps around institutional responsibility. And any TJ process should both address the harm that happened in and of itself and the people involved, but also think about advocacy and organizing about how you can shift those conditions by pushing the institution. So then.
Yeah, and I would say that in terms of consequence and punishment, just to like pull that out a little bit, absolutely that can look different in different communities and cultures. I think that a consequence is something that happens as a result of your actions. And so, if you're in a leadership position and you're, continually abusing interns, like a consequence of that would be taking you out of that position of power. And that could feel like a punishment, but in reality, it is an impact of you showing that you don't have the ability to hold that position without doing so in a harmful way. And a punishment, though, is usually constructed. And so it's like, I think that you did something wrong, so I'm going to devise some sort of like contrived thing that is, varying forms of like sadistic for you to really like learn your lesson, so that you'll change your behavior. But
it's kind of like an eye for an eye, like you will feel the pain that you incurred.
Right. But if you really like harmed someone, what you can learn from is understanding why that happened, and then taking action to make that right. And those are all consequences.
Yeah. So we're going to pull back to the last two questions a little bit later. I think let's keep going in this content, but really please keep putting the questions in there. We'll circle back to them.
Totally.
I think some of what you're talking about brings up this next topic of rethinking community. Often when we talk about transformative justice, people talk about community, which is very like romanticized and is like, oh, we all do everything together. I do think that universities have more of a like discrete community because there are like, are you on campus or are you not? Are you a student? Are you not? Like there's a bubble there, as opposed to like, are you part of the queer community of this city? Like, I don't know, that's kind of a hard thing to articulate.
Yeah, it's abstract when it's self-defined, and it's more tangible or something you can work with when there's like an active process of membership. And so some political organizations, some things like movement networks, campuses, things where it's an intentional community with set values that people either are a part of or can be asked to leave. And that's a consequence, right? Whereas like, I can't ask anyone to leave the queer community.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, hopefully you stay queer. I don't want you to become straight.
Totally, yeah.
Like, that seems bad. But I think a key part of this is really thinking like, what are the 3 to 5 people who are actual people that you talk to, that you can talk about this, that you can build a set of shared values and practices, and that you know how you're going to respond when things go down. Keeping in mind that anyone in that group can either be harmed or can commit harm. That's the expectation. Anyone can experience harm or commit it. And so you need to create a bubble that's able to be responsive to either of those things. And that's one of the biggest things that I would ask people to do is look up the Bay Area Transformative Justice collective pod mapping tool and think about who are your people that you're actually going to dig into this. Because it's one thing to say like, how can Vassar adapt? I don't know how Vassar can adapt. I don't know all the inner workings of your administration. I don't know what everyone buys into or what it takes to like join or what orientation is or whatever. But I do know that you can find 3 people at Vassar that you're going to talk to every month for the next year, thinking about these issues and how you're going to support each other through it. That is a tangible thing that you can do, right? And one of the first steps of that is identifying shared values and practices. And on the next few slides, we're going to share what are some of our core values. And we have 3 on our Patreon or on some of our platforms. I think it's linked in the interest form, are values and practices aligned with doing transformative justice around gender-based violence. But really find something that works for you and your people, right? And really what you want to be asking yourself is, how are we unlearning these systems together? How are we supporting each other in the journey of unlearning?
Yeah, and then, just on the point of anyone can be harmed and anyone can commit harm, I think this is especially important when you're thinking about gender-based violence. There's definitely an assumption in the sexual and domestic violence response that women identified people are always the survivor, and people who identify as men are the perpetrator. And I think just one note on that, like, people who grow up as boys definitely experience like forms of gendered violence that are accepted and even encouraged because of their gender presentation. That can be especially violent for trans people. And I think that we've had some of our biggest breakthroughs in processes around gender-based violence when you can hold some space for the person who caused the harm to acknowledge like how the harm that they experienced as a child and how that became normal to them enabled the harm that they committed. And I think that's true of like many forms of harm because, as Danielle Sarad says, like no one comes into harm for the first time by committing it. We've always either witnessed or observed or like experienced harm usually.
Definitely.
But that's a whole separate workshop. So
okay, and then we just want to name science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. I suspect that's what many of you are up to, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. So these are just some images of what could public safety look like without depending on the police. So what might happen if you're experiencing intimate partner violence? What might happen if your friends are intoxicated and fighting, but you don't want to get them in trouble? What might happen if someone is snooping in your car windows on your block and you're unsure of what to do, right? And these are all things that don't rely on the police to respond, right? And all of you can imagine other things, I'm sure. And this is a whole project put out there by Luna Cyanite, and you can find them online, or we can share them later.
Yeah.
And then we wanted to share. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of like close that part, like like Adrienne is saying here, this is visionary work, it's imaginative work, and I think that often people want like, what's the quick fix, what's the like policy, what's the reaction, and I think that for us at least, holding space, talking with people you trust about just like what's possible, and even just starting with like, what can we make?
Yeah.
Like what can I make in my own locus of control with the people that I have like shared values with, and that kind of gets into the presence of the things that we'll need to decenter
right.
the prison industrial complex
as part of the abolitionist journey, for sure. Okay, so then we wanted to share just 4 of our core values and just explain that when you choose a value, it's really important that you define what it means to you, because people have really different interpretations of values and why you think that it's important. So an example of this is healing is a process, not a destination. While we always hope for healing, it's an ongoing process that can't be bounded. We also talk about giving survivors and communities the tools, support, and agency to address harm and create a strategy to move forward. So that's like the goal of what we're doing. We know that people can often name their traumas and triggers, but less can name what they're doing to heal from and address them, or how we can support them when it happens. So part of our practice as a community is making space for how trauma shows up, and also challenging ourselves to do the work to find and use tools to address it and work on our healing and engage each other in supporting in that process. So these are, just a couple of them. We won't get into them too much, but what does liberation mean to us? Sustainability is a big one. We're thinking about long-term changes, not like short-term fixes, but also it's really important to find balance, know what your boundaries are, and not overextend yourself, like pretty much all of us do as soon as we start doing this work. So how can you take care of yourself, meet your needs, and be sustainable, and not just do like a ton of work for 1 year and then just disappear, although it's also totally okay to go in cycles. And then finally, we really wanted to name that in order for this to work, one of the biggest things that needs to change is we need to have a revaluation of care labor. Right now, care labor is often informal. It's expected of femmes and queer folks. It is often erased or undervalued. I can't tell you how many times I hear these like really privileged, especially white men being like, I got here all on my own. I did this totally on my own. And I'm like, I know for a fact that a lot of people provided so much care, whether it's processing, feeding you, whether it's the formal process of like making sure that you have what you need, or just the informal process of processing your emotions and helping you learn. So much of that needs to happen for people to transform and for people to grow and for people to achieve their goals. And that is often ignored and undervalued and not really acknowledged as part of the process of transformation. And so even if it is a formal job, you're a nurse, you're an elder care worker, you're an early childhood care provider, right? These are often feminized care fields that are underfunded and underappreciated. So a big part of that is that we can advocate for the revaluation of this work so that we're actually paid fairly when it comes to formal labor. And when it comes to informal labor, Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasina in the work Care Work, which is Dreaming Disability Justice into Reality, has an essay that's called it's a modest proposal for a fair trade care economy. And what she advocates for is that care should be consensual, it should be reciprocal, it should be valued. We should be able to get time off and not have it be expected constantly. And there should be a more equitable distribution so that it's not only expected of certain bodies. And I really recommend reading that essay. It's super, super strong. And it's really helped me think about what are my boundaries? What do I ask for in exchange for what I'm offering without needing to turn it into a monetary exchange, but recognizing that labor it takes and I need to be refilled. And like there can be an exchange there and a recognition of what I'm willing to offer, right?
And this definitely gets back to boundaries and how you put those in practice as you're doing this type of work. And Leah is a transformative justice practitioner.
Oh, for sure.
As well.
And then finally, we just wanted to share what's next. The first is that we definitely recommend folks reading more, engaging in personal reflection. And while we have like whole kind of book lists around transformative justice, we just wanted to highlight what we just finished reading, which is Beyond Survival, which is an anthology of transformative justice practices by Jairus Dixon and Leah, who we mentioned before, who are both transformative justice practitioners.
Yeah. And that's more of an anthology about people's experiences attempting to practice this. And then Fumbling Towards Repair is a workbook, amazing, very accessible.
And it's for people who are trying to practice this.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like tools for if you're practicing this. Things that we just got in the mail that we're excited to read include The Politics of Trauma by Stacey Haynes and I Hope We Choose Love, Notes from a Trans Girl at the End of the World, I think is what the subtitle is.
Yeah, and then I'm really excited about Turn This World Inside Out and like the shift towards nurturance culture. And Nora Samaran had a popular op-ed or article a while ago that was like the opposite of rape culture is nurturance culture. And then she went and turned that into a book and really fleshed out that idea.
I love when they do that.
Yeah, and is really talking about like harm, foundations of harm, very much these ideas of transformative justice. I know just from the intro was giving examples of schools and schools that had implemented restorative practices and like were honoring student autonomy and engaging in those. And then We Keep Us Safe is just kind of rethinking the language of safety and how you can build those resources in your community. And all of those, I think Turn This World Inside Out, I think is focusing a little more on gender. We Keep Us Safe, I think is focusing a little more on race, but absolutely you can, read those together.
And then we definitely encourage you to support the movement for Black lives in whatever ways make sense for you. There are a variety of ways of supporting, but besides direct action. If you are a Vassar student, we would love for you to join our TJ Summer Learning Series. The interest form is that tinyurl.com/VassarTJ. I think that it's case sensitive, so beware of that. But we would love for you to join us for the next it's about 3 weeks of actual content, and there's the opportunity to join a role play of what an accountability process looks like at the tail end of that, but that is only for Vassar students.
Yeah, and that will that as well as some of the content in our Patreon, which anyone is welcome to join, will give you, you know, more specific curated reading lists and also like spaces to discuss.
And space to ask us all the questions that you have, even if we're not able to get to all of them during the session.
Yeah, and I think that if you are interested in like, I want to practice this, I want to learn how to, I want to like continue learning in this, and I want to implement this in my own life, that's absolutely the space that we're trying to hold in our Patreon community. And this learning series that we're doing with Vassar, we're planning to offer a similar format of that for our Patreon community. And so even if you're not a Vassar student, you can still access that a little bit down the line. And I know in the Patreon community, we have, yeah, just resources we've made, a prototype of our transformative justice workbook. And if you join either of those, we're turning all of the tools and resources that we've developed over the last like 7 to 10 years into a a series of transformative justice zines. And so by participating in those two spaces, you would have first access to those.
Yes, and all of our patrons who have joined, thank you so
Yeah,
much
thank
for
you.
joining. Shout out to y'all for continuing in this journey, and keep an eye out, because if you're at $5 or above, you're going to be getting some new workbooks in the mail soon. So that's really exciting. And then finally, we have a new project coming up that we're really excited about, which we're making a resilience and revitalization zine that is actually based on contributions and submissions. And so if you're interested in that, please sign up on our website. We're gonna email out, or feel free to, you know, just message us here, or just keep an eye out for it. Probably in our Patreon is where we're most going to be recruiting for that. But those are going to be paid submissions, all about visions of what care and resilience look like. And so we're really excited to integrate your thoughts into that as well. And then finally, yeah, we'll just take some time to answer any of the questions that were there. Luckily, we did cover all of the content we planned on covering by the end of our time here. And so if you do need to leave, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again to Karina for hosting us for this conversation for the community. And maybe think about 1 to 2 people that you might want to share this video with that you think could go on this journey of unlearning punishment with you.
Yeah, and pretty much all of this, I know Instagram like gave up in the middle of it and I started it again, but pretty much all of this is on our Instagram live at Time to Spring Up for the next 24 hours. So you can share that with folks, or it'll be posted longer term on the YouTube.
And so let's see, what were the questions that we didn't get to?
Yeah, and I think we can, I definitely understand if folks have to leave. This is the end of our 90 minutes, but we'll stick around for maybe 5 to 10 minutes and just kind of
answer some questions,
respond to some of these questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop this share though. And I'd love to invite folks that if they want to turn on their video, that's totally okay, because now is the time that we're just like chatting.
Yeah, I'd love to see you.
But I'm just going to check out these questions and see. So I think the last one that we had is, people are calling for police officers that have been murders or complicit in the murder of Black people to be held accountable by putting them in prison, increasing their sentences. Right, yeah. So I think one thing to keep in mind is, like, I gotta tell you, when Harvey Weinstein was found guilty and I found out he was gonna go to prison, I was like, yes, like I'm super abolitionist, but I was still like a little happy when that happened, you know? So like, I can't blame people for wanting that to happen. Like, I get it, you know?
Yeah. Especially when people have just gotten away with things for so long and feel so protected by their power and privilege. I think that's where like you do get a little bit of like, okay, good. And then that like kind of validates the system too, where it's like, well, if it can get 1 or 2 of these very privileged people, who then, you know, maybe there's something redeemable about it. But I think that realistically, what would like feel like the best consequence to me is for all of them to like lose their jobs and like, no longer be able to like be paid to inflict violence in communities, you know, and that's a consequence.
Right. And I think another thing is like recognizing what the police system, because like we can make it about one individual or we can make it about the system, right? And like I think that sometimes when we get like what people consider as justice around one individual, it like almost excuses the system, right? And so one thing to keep in mind is that these like police systems are really about their money, right? So like if we can think about civil processes as well, where if a police officer commits violence against someone, that they could be charged with like like having a weapon when they're doing something, and that they can't have a weapon anymore. So whenever they're like policing in the future, they're not allowed to have weapons, or there are ways that they're personally financially responsible for any lawsuits around police violence, right? What are incentives that we can put in place that are large scale policies that shift how people see themselves as being responsible as opposed to like the system being responsible? So there are a lot of really interesting strategies around that. But again, like what happened when someone was asking about like the kill all rapists comment, right? Like the sentiment underneath it makes a lot of sense. And so we want to make space for that sentiment, and we want to make space to process other innovative ways to communicate that sentiment, because sometimes it's just laziness, right? There's like, it seems like the easy answer, so that's what we're going to advocate for, but it actually takes imagination to come up with something that's really going to like make long-term changes. Okay. Thinking about how to bring peers into TJ when applying it to their own lives and relationships with call out culture. Yeah, I mean, we all are for sure. I think part of it is like, hopefully we gave you some tools to like hit them with the logic. Like you really need to think about what convinces people. Some people are really convinced by like an emotional narrative, and then you can share like examples. Some people are more convinced by like the logic of explaining like, how does cancel culture fit into like the police and prison system that we're trying to shift? Or, you know, there are just different ways of thinking about argumentation. I'm like OG debater. I debated for a long ass time. So like really think about it as like an argument that you're going into, and you need to be prepared. Like, what are your warrants? What are your citations? What's your reading? You're like, fam, you got to read this. You don't get it.
And I think that one of the most powerful arguments, especially if we're talking about campus communities, and like there was a lot of sentiment of like, kick them off campus, that's a consequence, cut them off from their elite education, that will like, you know, make them really realize. And then it's like, wow, so you're saying that you want someone who you think is like a serial rapist to just go out into the community and have no like system to hold them, like so they can like keep doing that for the rest of their life. And I think that when we think of campuses or whatever resource groups we have as like bubbles of resource, it's like that is something that that community can do to try to intervene in and change that person's behavior before they continue doing it for the rest of their life, including on like communities that are less protected.
And I promise you that your university has more resources that you can draw on to support in this work than the community likely does, right? So if you're like, you got to be going to counseling, fam, while we're doing this work, there's counseling through the school. There's not very frequently free counseling through the community, right? So like, how can you draw on the resources that you have as being part of these privileged institutions instead of just saying like, push them out and let the community handle it, right?
Yeah, and then someone's asking about how transformative justice combats settler colonialism and how can we center Indigenous communities and wisdoms in transformative justice. Does it already do so? I think that the sort of, you know, adjacent field of restorative justice is absolutely like based on Indigenous practices, definitely about, you know, drawing on those and honoring those and learning about those.
I think that the field overall could do better of acknowledging that those are the roots and centering the voices of Indigenous people. But I know that there are a lot of really great organizations that are trying to make that happen and that are really focusing on that.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we definitely see organizing and like shifting of consciousness as a form of transformative justice. And I think that definitely like I've seen very powerful like educational projects, solidarity projects around, you know, supporting Indigenous people over the last few years. I see those as a form of transformative justice.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, processes of understanding the extent of the violence that was committed
and continues to be,
and understanding like the real impacts that people live with as a result of that, I definitely like could see that be. And then I don't know what extent right reparations would look like, or definitely like rethinking the whole, you know, social contract of the US. I think those would be implications of engaging in that transformative justice process.
But TJ is acknowledging the root causes of violence, right? And when we think about the fact that our nation was created on the genocide of Indigenous peoples and the taking of their land and their practices, then we need to understand that that's foundational to the way that our society operates. And that's the type of thing that we're talking about TJ addressing root causes, right? We need to talk about how that we celebrate Thanksgiving, we celebrate Columbus Day, like, come on, y'all, like, no. And that is a site for us to do transformative justice work.
Right. And so cities, like I know Minneapolis has, is no, like celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. I think Denver is now doing that as well. That's a slight symbolic step towards accountability, or at least like recognizing the harm that has happened.
And then this is, can you talk about the idea of justice in and of itself? That's a big question. I will say, like, something that's relevant about us and that we talk about a little bit more in terms of our, like, the roots of our practice of transformative justice is that both of us are deeply spiritual people, and both of us were raised in relatively religious environments or went to religious schools, and where we learned a lot about the like theological concepts of sin and like repair. And I would say that that is like a huge impact of the way that I think about justice outside of a legal sense, but in terms of like a spiritual and like soul sense. And the idea that like sin is separation and is pushing us away from each other. Violence is separation. And so justice is the process of mending that separation, either individually or as a collective, right?
Yeah, and to me, justice really does mean like things not being hidden, you know, and so like shining light, like shining truth on like the reality of what has happened, the reality of what's happening. And then through that truth telling, through that bearing witness, I think that absolutely is a fundamental part of restorative justice and transformative justice. And both of those really have people like naming their own experiences, engaging in like transformative education and growth. And I think that that to me is like kind of what justice feels like.
Yeah. And then this last question is, how do RJ and TJ differ? Restorative justice and transformative justice differ? That's a big question. There are a lot of disagreements about it. We have a whole kind of model that we'll present in the kind of teach-in over the summer. But the main difference, I would say, is there are people who are doing restorative justice in a transformative way, and there are people who are doing transformative justice in a way that mostly just addresses a harm. So the main differentiation is that restorative justice is about restoring the relationship in and of itself. So it's about, or the community that was damaged, right? So it's about a specific instance of harm and what's needed to address that instance. It's less about addressing root causes or changing norms in the community, right? It also tends to come more from a criminal justice background or people who are trying to do reform. A lot of RJ work is done within institutions or adjacent to the police, like the diversion program I was talking about earlier, or restorative justice in schools. A key thing is that transformative justice, as we said, is not really scalable in the same way. Restorative justice can literally be implemented in place and like instead of the way that police are responding. So to me, it's really an intermediary step. And we can even see how other countries, like in New Zealand, based on the practices of the Maori people, they implemented throughout the entire nation, started in the 1980s, that all juvenile cases went through a restorative justice process before they went into the courts. So like that's the type of thing that can really be scaled. Yeah. And it's mostly rooted in indigenous practices, whether that's the practices of the Yukon people in Canada and their like innovation of circle keeping. We have the Diné or Navajo Nation in the United States and the Lakota. They're implementing some really powerful restorative practices. The Maori in New Zealand. And so there are some really strong restorative justice practices. And there are definitely organizations like Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth that are doing that work in a transformative way. Whereas transformative justice is about shifting the conditions, and in partnership with community accountability is kind of the parallel to RJ in that it's about addressing an instance of harm through accountability in the community. But transformative justice is more of like an organizing framework or a mindset or something that doesn't necessarily scale or replace the police in the same way.
Yeah, transformative justice is like, let's dig up the roots of this harm and then like grow a different tree, you know, would be like the implications of it. But in practice, an accountability process can look somewhat similar, can use circles. And I think that, you know, if you're really interested in diving further into that, I would definitely like recommend signing up for this series over the
or
next
for our
month.
Patreon.
Yeah, or for the Patreon. And then we're like 10 minutes over, so I think we should wrap. But do you have a thought on this last question?
Yeah, just I would say that the limits of transformative justice to me are when there are people who continue to do the same harm over and over again and don't seem to be transformed through the process or don't want to participate in an accountability process.
Yeah, or people who like are very like, you know, intelligent and aware and educated and can like use this language to make it, to kind of like, you know, make it seem like they're doing this, but that they're also just kind of like saying what they, you know, think you want to hear. I think that's where it gets a little like very challenging. I think that's what we don't entirely know how to deal with.
There are some it's a small number of people. It's not as common as people think, when you actually create the conditions for folks to participate in a way that feels good. But there are some interesting strategies around like community-based detention that's not like fully isolation, but like homes and spaces that can contain people who are continuing to do harm or who are in like crisis. I would just say that if you're interested in this, like Mariam Kaba is like the best. I'm just extremely honored for her to be a mentor of ours. And I feel like I could sit at her feet and learn forever. Just follow her on Twitter at Prison Culture, like read everything she's ever made. There's the website Transform Harm that she created. Just absolutely incredible.
I think it's transformharm.org.
Transformharm.org.
And that's like just a library of like resources that she curated from everybody who's been doing this over the last like at least 50 years.
I would also recommend looking into the educational series around like accountable communities by the Barnard Center for Research on Women. They have both like long interviews like with us like this, and then they also have short videos that explore a lot of these topics, and they feature some of the most amazing transformative justice practitioners who have been doing this for a long time, and you can learn about a lot of people through those videos. I would also really highlight two other groups, Mimi Kim and the Creative Interventions community. They created a like 700-page free toolkit about community accountability in response to domestic violence and gender-based violence. Mimi Kim is like so rad. Like she's so rad and has been doing this so long. Like any opportunity to learn from her, anything that she's written, I just would totally recommend. And then the other one is the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And specifically out of that group, Mia Mingus. She is a advocate for disability justice, and she has a blog called Leaving Evidence that's super dope. And just the work of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective is like really, really fantastic.
Yeah. So, and then I think Conflict Transformation is an account on Instagram. So we can maybe pull together some of these resources and send them out after the fact. I think we have to wrap now. We're 15 minutes over, but I just really appreciate the y'all engaging, sharing questions, really like letting us know what you're thinking of. And I definitely hope that we'll at least see some of you in this Vassar kind of like ongoing series, and that we'll be able to really like have some of these conversations in a deeper and like more back and forth way.
An extra shout out to those of you who actually turned your video on for these last few minutes. Like sometimes it feels like we're speaking into a vacuum, and I'm like, I don't know how people feel about this at all, but like so nice to see your faces. You seem awesome, and I'm so happy that you were here listening. And I'm like, oh, I think they got it. It's okay. I don't think I pushed it too much. It's all right. So thank you for turning on your video, and thank you so much for joining. Wonderful to see your lovely faces.
All right. Thank
you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys. Appreciate you so much.
Yes. All right. So Karina, we will be in touch about next steps, and we're really excited to get started on this summer teach-in program. It's gonna be awesome.
That's too the Twitter type. Okay, about to start. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye, everybody. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Excited to continue learning with you.
Bye. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.